My name is Darren Jones. I'm the chair of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Select Committee here in the House of Commons, one of the 6 select committees that commissioned Climate Assembly UK back in 2019. And I'm delighted to be chairing the launch of the full report of Climate Assembly this morning, to have so many of you with us on the webinar, and of course, disappointed that we can't be here in person in the House of Commons due to the current restrictions. I'm pleased as well to welcome so many of our Assembly members on the webinar, 3 in particular who are joining us today to contribute their experiences to the discussion. And also a special thank you to the Secretary of State, Alok Sharma, who is with us this morning and will be speaking on behalf of the government. Once we've heard from the Secretary of State, we also have a plethora of speakers to go through the work that the Assembly has been doing, as well as comments from the committee chairs about the work that we'll be picking up in Parliament off the back of the report. So this morning we'll be hearing from Sarah Allen, who's the Head of Engagement at Involve, which is the charity that ran the Citizens' Assembly. We'll be hearing from Chris Stark, who is the Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change, which independently but officially advises government and Parliament on how we reach our climate change objectives. And we'll also be hearing some from our expert leads who were advising the Assembly members on the information they needed to digest and understand before forming their views. And as I say, we'll also be hearing from 5 other select committee chairs from across the House that commissioned this report about the work that we'll be doing to pick up the recommendations from Assembly members in our programmes of work here in the House of Commons. But before we get to our speakers, just a quick reminder about how we got here today. Back in June last year, Parliament agreed with a unanimous vote that we should set a statutory target to reach our net zero carbon emissions by 2050. But at that stage, what we didn't do was legislate the detail of how we were going to reach that target. We've now got to do that work, and the path that we choose to take will have an impact on all of our lives in every part of the country. The people and Parliament need to travel together on this journey to net zero. And that's why all of us across the 6 select committees established the Assembly with the specific task of considering the best way to go about meeting that target, taking in the views of the spectrum of the British people across the country. So to the Assembly members who took part, we on all of our 6 select committees are delighted that you have taken up this challenge on our behalf, on behalf of your and our Parliament, to set out how we can achieve those targets. The report published in full this morning provides us with a unique insight into the considerations, concerns and hopes of the British people as we seek to put these policies together and to implement them. So before we go into speakers, we will have a short video that will be played just to show us how the Assembly unfolded over the past months, and that will now be played to you now.
Dear resident.
Dear resident.
Dear resident.
You could be one of over 100
people selected to take part in the UK-wide Citizens' Assembly
on how should
the UK tackle climate change. It's an interesting proposition.
I'm Amanda from Kent and I'm 27.
So this weekend is going to be about introducing you to climate change in a thorough way.
It was really exciting to be told I was selected. It just seemed like a very rare opportunity.
Initially, I wasn't sure what it would be like, because I hadn't done anything like that before.
Perfectly honest with you, I didn't have a clue what zero carbon was.
I didn't know enough about climate change. I was open to information.
There were so many different perspectives and opinions, so many people of different ethnicity, different ages.
It was so nice to see, the representation of the UK.
The fact that you've given up time to come here and take this seriously is of the greatest importance.
It felt like the community kind of working together towards a problem that the whole world needs to face, to be fair.
Obviously at the moment we're all on lockdown.
Moving on to 3 internet weekends was quite good. We were still investigating things on our own. I'm not saying we're experts now, but we all have opinions.
everybody's had the taste of this cleaner air. Surely most people would want that for their children and their grandchildren.
Well, if we treat climate change the same way as we're treating coronavirus, then we can do it.
We all want the government to take heed of our recommendations.
They need to act on it, but also to act on it fast. So it's not about saying, okay, we just keep deliberating over it over the next 1 year, 2 years.
They are by law bound to try to get to this target.
It's got to be done in a fair and positive way.
So if we don't act now, we're just going to run out of time and there won't be a future for any of us.
And if we can show that we can do it, then perhaps others will follow. I think somebody has to be a leader.
Well, thank you for that video. I thought that was a great insight into the energy, the purpose and the excitement that went through the Assembly, and great to see so many different types of people coming together to go through the detail and consider the difficult trade-offs that sometimes we need to make, but the shared purpose of putting into action the outcomes of the Assembly so that we can make the changes that we need to see, not least with events happening around the world right now, reminding us of the importance of doing that. So we're now going to hear from some of the Assembly members who I'm pleased are joining us this morning on the webinar. And we'll first be speaking with Sue. So Sue, you have the floor for 2 minutes.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sue and I live in Bath. Back in the beginning of November last year, I received an invitation from the House of Commons to participate in the Climate Assembly UK. I soon realised what a unique opportunity it would be to take part and was very pleased to be selected. I looked upon it as my public duty and regarded it as similar to doing jury service. I knew very little about climate change when I first started this journey, and I've always regarded myself as being open-minded, and I look forward to learning about a subject that I knew very little about. The first weekend was very intense. It was hard work, but it was also very interesting. And the highlight of the weekend was having Sir David Attenborough come and talk to us on the Saturday evening. And he came to thank us for our participation and reiterated the importance of what we were doing. The process itself at the weekends worked very well. We would listen to the professional lead and then they would give us the information. And then we would have time to discuss it at our table, which was usually a table of about 8. We would get the opportunity to ask questions. And then once they'd been answered, we got to decide on solutions and then vote on which we considered to be the best choice. When we couldn't attend the last weekend due to COVID-19, they came up with the idea of doing the meetings via Zoom and spread them over 3 weekends. And that worked out quite well. It wasn't the same as being in the same room and discussing things in person, but it did get the job done. I feel that the way that the citizens' assemblies are conducted is a unique way of allowing everyday normal people to get involved and help make decisions. I found the whole process very enjoyable, and I've learned so much about climate change, and I realise the importance of making changes to our lives so that we can achieve net zero by 2050. My personal journey has begun, and I have now purchased a second-hand electric vehicle, and I've also just become a parish councillor. I thought this would give me an opportunity to use the knowledge and encourage and support my local community to adapt to a greener future. And over the last few months, the UK have proved that they can adapt well to change. Now we just need our governments to lead the way for us all to change and getting us all engaged and interested in achieving net zero for the future generations.
Sue, thank you for that. And the impetus there at the end for the government to take action is perfectly timed, because we're now going to hear from the Secretary of State, Alok Sharma, who I'm delighted is joining us this morning, who will need to leave after his speech, unfortunately, because of his diary. But thank you, Secretary of State, for joining us this morning. The floor is yours.
Darren, thank you very much for that. And could I also thank all the 6 select committees and the chairs for convening the Climate Assembly, and actually most importantly a huge thank you to all the members for the very many hours of work that you've put into this. Great to hear from Sue this morning in terms of where that journey has taken her so far. And I have to say, I think this assembly really represents the very best of civil society. It's people from across the whole country who've come together, giving up their time to shape the future on climate action. And this is the most important issue of our time. On that, I think we are all absolutely agreed. And I can tell you that the government, the Prime Minister, we are all alert to the urgency of the climate crisis. And we are committed, as the Prime Minister said, to build back better, a green, resilient economic recovery. And there is a lot in this report to agree with from a government perspective. You recommended planting more forests. We've committed to plant 30,000 hectares of trees every year by 2025. You've called for more wind and solar power. We announced that the onshore wind and solar projects can now bid for contracts in the next Contracts for Difference allocation round. You've called for more investment in low carbon buses and trains. And the government's committed to invest in 4,000 brand new carbon zero buses. You've called for a faster transition to zero emission vehicles, and you will know that we've consulted on bringing forward the end of the sale of new petrol, diesel and hybrid cars and vans from 2040 to 2035, or indeed earlier if a faster transition is feasible. But of course, we know as government that there is much more to do. But I'm also aware that government alone cannot achieve all the change that we need. It requires all of us collectively to work together, politicians, policymakers, businesses, and of course, the public. Because the move to a net zero economy affects absolutely every single one of us. And everyday decisions that we take will be critical. The Committee on Climate Change estimates that 62% of emissions reductions involve some form of behavior change from each of us. A family, for example, investing in the energy efficiency of their homes, a supermarket shopper choosing sustainable foods, a worker deciding to cycle rather than take the car, or as Sue has done, to take up an electric vehicle. The question is, how do we encourage those changes in a way that is fair and ultimately acceptable to the public? And of course, this is something that you in the Assembly have considered at length. And frankly, a large part of the answer is the one that you give in your report. Involve the public. So the decisions we make in government align with society's concerns and values. For many years, we've funded public workshops, including on climate change. However, we recognise that we need to do more. And I do believe that actually the Climate Assembly has shown us the benefits of working with a dedicated group. One that's been given time and information to consider complex issues in full. And we agree with the spirit of your recommendations on greater citizenship involvement around climate change and net zero. And this report will help to shape the work that we in government are doing over the next critical 14 months. And of course, you know, next November, in 14 months, COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference, will be held in Glasgow. And in the run-up, states must come forward with renewed emissions reduction targets, their NDCs. And in holding the presidency of COP26, the UK is urging all countries to make these targets as ambitious as possible and to commit to reaching net zero as soon as they can. And I do know that there is an expectation on us in the UK as well. And of course, we've already put into law our target to reach net zero by 2050. And in the run up to COP, we will publish our own NDC. And the Assembly's report will help to inform our plans. I've asked my officials to look at its recommendations in detail. We've also invited the Assembly expert leads to present their recommendations in 7 briefings to government officials over the next 2 weeks. And we will cover all the policy areas that have been discussed in the report. And as part of that review and that engagement, officials will then, of course, look to see what more we can do as part of that engagement process. Because I do think that the kind of cooperation that we've had here is going to be absolutely crucial. It is only by working together that we will help and reach net zero. And all of us, I think we understand this, play and must play our part in limiting global temperature rises. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary of State, for your contributions this morning. And all of us on our select committees look forward to working with you and your colleagues in the Cabinet to bring forward those policies as we reach our net zero target. We're now going to be diving into some of the detail of the report with Sarah Allen, who is Head of Engagement at Public Participation Charity Involve, who ran the Assembly, and Chris Stark, Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change, who acted as one of the expert leads who helped design and deliver the Assembly. So I'm going to hand over now to Sarah and Chris to dive into some of the detail.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so pleased to be speaking today at the launch of the report of what is a UK first, the first ever UK-wide Citizens' Assembly on Climate Change. I'd like to say a few words about the Assembly's membership and process, but before I do that, I want to start with one or two overarching thoughts. So firstly, Climate Assembly UK aims to strengthen and to support the UK's parliamentary democracy. And it does that by ensuring that our elected representatives in Parliament, in government, as well as others, have the best possible information available to them about public preferences for how to reach net zero. And that's so important because, as Darren Jones said earlier, the decisions about how we get to net zero are going to have such a big impact on people's lives. The Assembly's report that we're publishing today provides a really valuable body of evidence about the public's views. And it's the range, the breadth and the depth of that informed and considered recommendations and opinions that it contains that makes it so special. The unique nature of the report has been made possible because of how the Assembly process worked, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So Climate Assembly UK has 108 Assembly members, and they come from all walks of life and all across the UK. In terms of pure numbers, the Assembly and the Assembly members are representative of the wider population in terms of demographics, so age, gender, ethnicity, and educational level. Also geography, whether they live in an urban or a rural area and where in the UK they live. And importantly, also their level of concern about climate change. But that's just numbers, and I want to give you a bit more of a feel for what it's like to attend the Assembly itself. So when we first met the Assembly, the youngest Assembly member was 16 and the oldest was 79. And the Assembly members included people who work for the NHS, who are cleaners, engineers, currently unemployed, business owners, full-time carers, and so many other roles. The Assembly members came together over 6 weekends between late January and mid-May this year, and each of them committed nearly 60 hours to the Assembly process, which is a huge amount of time and a wonderful commitment. At the weekends, the Assembly members spent time first learning about the issues, so they heard from 47 speakers in total, with a wide range of different perspectives about how the UK should get to net zero, and then they got to question those speakers in depth. After that, they spent time carefully considering what they had heard with one another. And they didn't just talk about during those discussions what the speakers had said, but they also brought in their own life experiences, their own values, their own needs, and their own preferences. And they had those discussions before then making their final decisions and deciding on their final recommendations by secret ballot. Across the Assembly weekends, the Assembly members went on a real journey, and that journey is mirrored by the chapters in the final report. So the Assembly started with brief background information for the Assembly members about climate change and about the science. And then the Assemblies went on at the very first Assembly weekend to hear evidence about the overarching ethical and strategic questions for the path to net zero before reaching their first recommendations on underpinning principles. And Chris is going to say a bit more about those in a minute. At the next few weekends then, the Assembly looked at the 5 topics with significant potential for impact on our lifestyles. So how we travel by land and air, heat and energy use in the home, what we eat and how we use the land, and what we buy. The Assembly then completed its main topics by looking at the areas for electricity and how we remove any remaining greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. Finally, on the Assembly's final weekend, we created an opportunity for Assembly members to consider the changed context for reaching net zero resulting from COVID-19. And the Assembly also decided on its final additional recommendations. Taken together, Climate Assembly UK's recommendations set out a clear and an internally consistent path to net zero. And I'm going to hand over Chris to run you through some of the headlines.
Thanks, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. So on behalf of the 4 expert leads in this process, Becky, Jim, Lorraine, and I, and on behalf of the many experts and specialists who've taken part in this process and volunteered their time, I just wanted to start by saying thank you. Thank you most of all to the Assembly members themselves, whose views are contained in this report, of course, but also thanks to the select committees in Parliament who commissioned this work, and a special thanks to Sarah and all the team involved who coordinated this process so well. It really is tremendous to see the report, and I encourage you all to read it. It's a real first. We have had for decades in the UK a community of technical scientific experts who've been building this rich and detailed picture of what's happening with the climate science and the urgent actions that we need to take to decarbonise the UK and our society. Every year we grow our understanding of how to tackle this issue, but we have never had evidence like this before. This is the first time, from my perspective at least, that we can say we really understand the views of UK citizens. It is a genuinely representative group, 108 real people, as you would expect, many differing views, many differing backgrounds, including, as Sarah said, on climate change itself. This is a process that's brought those people together. We've done our best to arm them with the best possible information on climate change and the options before us, and given them a voice to express their views on what I think is one of the critical issues facing the UK today. And we now understand in detail the steps that the Assembly support, also what they don't support, and crucially, we also have the detail on why that was their position, why they've concluded these things. So for me, this is special because it isn't the product of modelling. It doesn't emerge from a technical assessment. It doesn't come from a spreadsheet. It's the views of ordinary, real people in our country reflecting their own lived experience and answering a very simple question, which is how should the UK reach net zero? Not whether we should reach net zero, but how should we do it? And I think the real power of this process is that the question was constrained in that way. It's very carefully planned, very carefully facilitated. And from it, we now understand what practical steps people are willing to take to deliver the statutory targets that we have in the UK. That is genuinely new from my perspective. So it's my privilege now to take you through the main findings of the Assembly. A plea at the outset, though, to take the time, if you have it, to read the report. The exec summary is really, really accessible. There's some rich detail on the views that have been expressed by the Assembly in the main report itself. And it's really worth a read, worth your time. So let's begin with the principles that the Assembly members came up with. Worth saying at the outset, these are not motherhood and apple pie. They're really important principles that ran right the way through this process. Back at the very first weekend in Birmingham, the Assembly members came together for the very first time. They heard about the background to the net zero target. They heard about the science of climate change, some of the ethical and strategic questions about reducing emissions. And they then considered some principles that they wanted to guide the UK's path to net zero. They agreed 25 of those underpinning principles, and they voted also to prioritise them. Important to say, these are themselves recommendations to government, but they're also principles that the Assembly used themselves to inform their work over the subsequent weekends. I'm not going to take you through them all, but I did want to cover the major ones. You'll find these in the Assembly's opening statement, which is a really powerful statement of their final conclusions and all of this. Number one on the list is the one that you see here. It's about improved information and education for all on climate change. The Assembly members appreciated the opportunity that they'd had through this process to learn about the issues. They wanted that opportunity to be extended to others in the UK. A really clear desire from the Assembly members to open up the discussion of climate change and the steps to address it, and to build a better understanding of why the country was making the changes that are recommended in this report. Next is fairness. Fairness was defined as a concept by the Assembly themselves. It was an issue that came up again and again in the Assembly's deliberation. They were looking for solutions that promoted fairness, so fairness across sectors, across the different geographies of the UK, for rural and urban areas, They wanted steps that protected those who could least afford to pay, also things that promoted better health outcomes overall, really broad definition of fairness. Another theme that came up in the Assembly discussions was freedom of choice for individuals and for local areas. This is the idea that in many of the choices that we now face, there should be options and scope, I suppose, for individuals and local areas to be involved in defining the changes that will reduce emissions. Some of these changes are, of course, very fundamental. Next is this one, making the most of potential benefits. Now, of course, this is about more than just reducing emissions. And what the Assembly members said is that we should be making the most of the wider benefits of this transition, the positive impacts for the environment more broadly, or the new economic opportunities that emerge from this as the UK decarbonises. It's an opportunity to take steps to improve health, to reduce pollution, even to renew local high streets, really important. The natural environment is next. Real concern, as you'll see in some of the Assembly's recommendations a bit later. As we make the move to net zero, the Assembly were really clear that nature needed to be protected and restored where possible. There was strong support for steps that promote biodiversity, widen access to nature as well. And lastly, in principles, the need for leadership. So government must lead this transition as they're required to by law, but that leadership needs to be proactive and where possible with cross-party consensus wherever that is possible. And that's a really strong message to parliamentarians too. So what I'd like to do now is to move on to the recommendations on the steps to reach net zero themselves. I can't possibly do justice to this in the 5 minutes or so available, but there's a really brilliant summary in the exact summary of the report. And I hope that will encourage you to then read the main report. So let's begin with travel and surface transport. So Assembly members didn't support major restrictions on travel, but looked instead to some of the positive steps to encourage a transition from fossil fuel transport. There was support for an early phase out of petrol and diesel cars and vans by 2030 to 2035. That's an issue that's now on Grant Shapps' desk. Grant support was supported to make the alternative to petrol and diesel cars, that's electric vehicles, more affordable. There was strong support for improved public transport provision too, so making public transport cheaper and more frequent. Also support for the alternatives to cars, cycling and scootering particularly. Some of the most interesting conclusions were about aviation. There was support for passenger numbers to grow overall, but a really strong message that that growth needed to be controlled. So 25 to 50% growth from 2018 to 2050. That's lower than the DFT projections. Assembly members wanted investment in the alternatives to air travel, like fast rail, and they supported taxes that increase as people fly more often or further. There was also recommendations to invest in cleaner aviation technologies like synthetic fuels. On then to in the home. And the Assembly discussed various approaches to decarbonising heat supply and to making homes more energy efficient. So on zero carbon heating, the Assembly backed heat pumps, heat networks, and hydrogen as the three major routes through this to zero carbon heating. But they felt that local areas and individuals should be able to choose the solutions that best suited them. They backed a ban on new gas boilers, and that ban should come in between 2030 and 2035. And on retrofitting homes, they emphasised the need to minimise disruption as much as possible. That means providing reliable, clear information to the public, support for homeowners and tenants to meet the costs of retrofit from the government if possible, and the need for solutions to work, of course, for all income groups and housing types. They also wanted smaller organisations to have the opportunity to supply some of those energy services, and there was a lot of support for local plans for these low carbon homes that we will need. On to what we eat and how we use the land. And here the Assembly wanted to see a future centred around three things broadly. Firstly, local produce and local food production. Secondly, a voluntary shift in diet, a change in diet to reduce our meat and dairy consumption by between 20 and 40%. with better food labelling, particularly on the carbon impacts to help with that. And thirdly, a kind of managed diversity of land use in the future. So on changing our use of land, Assembly members really wanted to see, firstly, low carbon farming, which they suggested should be encouraged through regulation, and that land managers or farmers should receive an income if they use their land to absorb and store carbon through some of the natural steps to do that, woodland creation or restoring natural carbon stores. The Assembly recognised that this would represent a pretty big shift in patterns of agriculture, and they wanted to see farmers supported through that transition with information and training provision for the people who work and manage the land. On then to what we buy, and the Assembly identified a few key steps to change what we buy in the future. They were looking for businesses to make products using fewer resources and using lower carbon energy and materials if possible. The Assembly recommended resource efficiency targets and standards to support that. They also identified public procurement as a key lever and the rules there as a means to drive change by awarding contracts to low carbon suppliers if the government is doing that. Secondly, individuals repairing and sharing more. So technical and financial support to businesses who offer sharing or even renting services to help with that transition. They were looking for better information to promote informed choices and changes in individual behaviour. So we've talked already about labelling, but labelling and information about carbon information and carbon emissions on all the products and services that are sold in the UK. There was broad support too for advertising bans and restrictions for high carbon products, and also support for measures aimed at increasing recycling rates. That includes deposit return schemes and also increased doorstop recycling. Now, one of the main questions facing the UK on its journey to net zero is the question of where electricity comes from. All of the UK's electricity generation will need to be low carbon to meet the net zero target, of course, and some really striking results from the Assembly members. There were large majorities for 3 ways of generating low carbon electricity in particular: offshore wind, solar power and onshore wind. These were seen as proven and low cost. Offshore wind came out strongly because it's located out of the way. Solar was viewed as quite a useful thing because it could be located in a number of different locations. Some important conditions on that support, though. Assembly members were keen to highlight the need to consider location carefully, also the environmental impacts, and also where the technology was manufactured was a factor. More limited support for 3 other means of generation: bioenergy, where there were some well-expressed concerns about the wider environmental impacts of burning trees and crops for energy; nuclear, where Assembly members expressed some key concerns around cost, safety of safe storage for fuel, spent fuel, and the decommissioning costs too. And fossil fuels with carbon capture received more limited support. Most concerns there centred on the safety of the storage of the carbon and the fact that it might prolong our use of fossil fuels overall. So on to one of the toughest topics. So by mid-century, we are still expecting that there will be some greenhouse gas emissions, residual emissions in the UK economy, even after we've reduced emissions as much as possible. And for those remaining emissions, particularly from aviation and from agriculture, we are going to need to meet the net zero goal an equivalent amount of greenhouse gas removals in the steps ahead of us. So the Assembly came to this deliberately as one of the last topics so that we could then allow them to reflect on the decisions that they'd made in previous weekends, and especially to account for those residual emissions from farming and aviation. Really strong support for the natural means of removing carbon from the atmosphere. So growing forests, increasing woodland cover, as long as, I should say, as the right trees were grown in the right places. Also managing forests more effectively to maximise the carbon that they absorb. Also restoring and managing peatlands and wetlands, and using timber where possible in construction to store carbon in our buildings for long periods. There was more limited support, quite clearly more limited support for the more technologically based removal methods. So bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, for example, and direct air capture and storage too. Again, the concern of the Assembly here was mainly around the safe storage of carbon through BECCS and DACCS as a means. And lastly, a topic that we had not expected to cover when the Assembly was first planned, of course, and that was COVID-19. COVID hit the country right in the middle of this Assembly process, and that presented, therefore, a very unique opportunity to understand how the Assembly felt about COVID-19, their experiences of the lockdown, how the recovery from COVID might interact with net zero. That was something that many of the Assembly members themselves wanted to consider. 4/5 of Assembly members strongly agreed or agreed that steps taken by the government to help the economy recover should be designed to help achieve net zero. Really striking result. The recommendations on how to do that included limitations or conditions on government's investment in high carbon industries, also investment in net zero infrastructure as a means to get the economy going. 96% of Assembly members strongly agreed or agreed that as lockdown eases, that government and employers more generally should actually proactively take steps to encourage lifestyles to change, to be more compatible with reaching net zero. Some of the things we've experienced during the lockdown, like encouraging more home working, changes also to how we travel and commute. And I think there was also an awareness of the economic impacts of COVID and how that might make reaching net zero more difficult to achieve overall. I think these were really some of the most important insights that we got from the Assembly members over the 6 weekends. And very finally, on the last weekend, the Assembly discussed what further recommendations they themselves wanted to make to Parliament and government. They came up with these themselves. They voted in favour of 39 additional recommendations. Again, I won't go through all of these, of course, but they covered in particular transparency, accountability and decision making, education again, education, communication and engagement, the COVID issues, generations and equality, international action and impacts. All of these were selected completely independently of any expert guidance, and I think that is testament to how in-depth and informed the discussions really were amongst the Assembly. The Assembly didn't pass two further proposals. Both of those were focused on reaching net zero by an earlier date than the statutory date of 2050. Slightly more Assembly members opposed an earlier date than supported it, although it's worth saying that the balance was held by those who were unsure or didn't mind. But again, a really interesting result. And a very final word from me. I'd just like to conclude with some personal reflections on this, and a word really on citizens' assemblies themselves. And I think I speak for all of the expert leads in this process on this. This was a tremendously valuable process, which could and I think really should be repeated. So the power of this for me was that it was advisory, of course, but it feeds directly into Parliament, so to the 6 select committees. It doesn't therefore sweep away the existing democratic representation that we have. I think it complements it, and that is so important. My own organisation, the CCC, is going to use more of these deliberative approaches in the future, I hope, in our research. I hope others do too. For me and my organisation, of course, this is new data, but for this Assembly, it's a set of recommendations that they now would like to see implemented, and I hope that ministers listen and act on that. This, for me, is a really balanced, proportionate set of recommendations. If I were a minister, I'd be really pleased to see this. So there's a realistic package here, and I know that we in the Committee on Climate Change are going to make full use of this work in our recommendations to government after this. But with that, I'm going to just say thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to Sarah for your presentation. And for those of you that want to get involved in the detail even more than that, you can read the executive summary and the report online at climateassembly.uk, but also the team will be running a series of in-depth briefings over the next few weeks, and the details for those will be circulated to you should you want to take part into those detailed briefings. Right, we're now going to hear from 2 more Assembly members before we come to a string of politicians. We've got Mark first and then Ibrahim. So Mark, who is one of our 3 Assembly members here with us this morning, the floor is yours for 2 minutes. I don't know if we have a IT challenge there. So in the meantime, oh, there we go. Mark, hello.
There you go. Sorry. Good morning. I'm pleased to be here today to have the opportunity to share my thoughts and experience of the Climate Assembly. When the letter came through the post, I realised it was an opportunity that I couldn't turn down. the chance to possibly influence and be part of making my children and grandchildren's future safer and better. Being a part of the Climate Assembly weekends was fantastic. I got to hear from the leading experts in their field and meet people from all over the United Kingdom, each with their own story, background and opinions. It is great when you have your opinion challenged, and by becoming better informed, it makes you see things from a different perspective. My main takeaway from the Assembly is that to tackle climate change effectively, politicians need to cooperate cross-party and deal with this as a crisis rather than a political point-scoring exercise. I think citizens' assemblies are essential as a means for the government to get a better understanding of the feelings of the population on certain subjects at both national and regional level. My one piece of advice to the government and Parliament about reaching net zero is don't be scared, be bold, aim big. People are willing to change if educated properly and given the facts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And now over to Ibrahim, again for 2 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Ibrahim. I'm from Surrey. I decided to get involved in the Climate Assembly UK because it was a great opportunity to be part of shaping the future of how we live and also how we make sure we can contribute to live on the earth for a long time to come. It opened an opportunity for me to learn, to self-reflect, to interact and to feel involved with a representative group of the UK population in making decisions that could impact on our immediate and our long-term future. I must say the experiences I gained from the Assembly weekends in Birmingham were very valuable. It was really nice to get the opportunity to get the information from experts, and it was done in a form that was understandable to me and to the other Assembly members. It was also a great opportunity to meet so many Assembly members from different parts of the UK, and all of them with different living circumstances and needs. The team organizing the Assembly were also superb in answering our queries, and they made the Assembly run very smoothly. I did have some background basic knowledge about tackling climate change prior to the Assembly, but definitely this has improved significantly after the Assembly. I learned a lot about what we can do in our homes, transport, what we eat, farming, and methods of green energy production that are sustainable. A lot of change will need to be done, and I've realized that this change has to start actually from an individual level, and that starts from learning about the issues and solution. And to enable this succeed, it is vital for the government to provide the right information and incentives to encourage this change. Citizens' assemblies, I believe, are excellent, and the government should use them more, especially in relation to issues that have long-term consequences on people's lives, health, and well-being. If done properly, citizens' assemblies can offer a true reflection on the thoughts and wishes of the population of the country, and generally, the decisions tend to be more acceptable to the public. So if I had a message to the government, to the Parliament, it is to act now. No delays, every minute counts, and every action taken will make positive changes towards the climate timeline. Thank you very much.
Ibrahim, thank you so much. And Ibrahim, Mark and Sue, thank you so much for your contributions this morning. It's given us a real insight into the amount of energy and work that you've put into this process and reminding us of how useful this has been and the impetus upon all of us now to take it forward. And on that note, and on your call there, Ibrahim, for Parliament to do its bit, you are now going to hear from 6 of us who chair some of the select committees here in the House of Commons that commissioned this work. And we're going to start first with my colleague from the Treasury Select Committee, Mel Stride. So Mel, the floor is yours.
Well, Darren, thank you. And like the other speakers, I've been asked to speak for just 2 minutes, so hence the timing that I will adopt. Can I start by once again thanking all those who have taken part in this extraordinary and brilliant exercise, those who organised it, those who presented, and most of all, of course, those who participated as part of the 108 people who took part. I was very proud that my committee was one of the 6 that chose to support this and help to set this initiative up, and indeed very proud that I addressed the Assembly on its final day, albeit remotely because of coronavirus at that point. I think Chris just now made a very important point, which is to point out, in terms of the democratic process, of course, the Climate Assembly is not the same thing as the government. However, I believe, as I know he does, that it does have authority. And I think there are two reasons for that, having observed this process. The first is the way in which the participants have been selected. And we've heard much about that in the presentation this morning. It has been a representative sample of individuals, and I think the objective way in which the sessions have been held has been a real strength. And the second reason, I think, is because another point that Chris made actually about the recommendations that have been made. These strike me as being proportionate, which was the word that he used, and also sensible. So nobody's saying we should ban meat, nobody's saying we should stop flying tomorrow or take all cars off the road this time next fortnight. And I think there is some good, measured, proportionate, sensible recommendations here, respecting this notion of the freedom of choice. And I think if we're going to carry the public with us, freedom of choice is something, and I know a main underlying principle that the Assembly thought was important. Very quickly on my committee, firstly, this report will inform our committee. We will look at it as a committee very closely. We had a presentation on it yesterday, which a number of my committee members and myself attended. We have resurrected an inquiry that we had in the last Parliament on decarbonisation and green finance. So that's looking at tax and spend and regulation and how that can help us get to net zero, and also how the finance sector, which of course is huge in the UK, can make sure that investment goes into the right areas of the economy so that we hit that target in 2050. Examples of all of this stuff is on our website, so I do urge anybody listening to this to log on to the Treasury Committee website and track our inquiries. And the final thing I would say is the point that the last speaker made and emphasised, which is that we really do have a duty now, given the gravity of what we need to achieve over the coming years, to work together. And you have my commitment and my committee's commitment to do just that. Thank you.
Mel, thank you so much. We're now going to Lillian Greenwood, who was the chair of the Transport Select Committee and is still a member of that committee. And Lillian was involved in setting up the Assembly in 2019. So Lillian, over to you.
Thanks, Darren, and good morning, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here this morning and deputising for the chair of the committee, Hugh Merriman. It feels like a really long time ago, back in January, when the 108 of you put your own lives aside and travelled to Birmingham for that first Assembly weekend. I think, like others, I'm incredibly grateful for the work that you've put in, 6,000 hours of work listening to 47 speakers, travelling goodness knows how many miles, battling Storm Ciara to get to Birmingham and going online through the pandemic. I went along to that first weekend and I saw for myself the energy that was in the room, particularly after you'd heard from Sir David Attenborough. And I think that energy is there again today, listening to Sue and Mark and Ibrahim. And I think there's genuine excitement today as well, not just here in this webinar, but perhaps wider as we see the results of your deliberations. Now, I think sometimes us politicians and maybe campaigners too, we think we have the answers. Perhaps sometimes we're even accused of preaching. But now we need to listen, and we need to listen to all voices. You were a representative group, and I think that's really important, because sometimes we just hear the loudest. And I think your participation, coming from all corners of the UK, from different backgrounds, from different ages, different experiences, opens a window into what the public preferences of the UK are. And your report outlines a pathway for us to achieve net zero in the UK by 2050. And it does it in a way that's fair, and it does it in a way that gives people and local places choices. And I think really importantly, you reached your conclusions because you had information, you were informed and could make those informed choices. And I was really pleased to say in your principles that you explain that education is really important, that everybody needs to understand the basis on which you reach these recommendations so that they too can understand the choices before us. Now, you've already heard from Chris Stark some of the recommendations about how we travel, things like making public transport more convenient, reliable and cheaper, investing in low carbon buses and trains, facilities to get us cycling and scootering more, providing grants to get people and businesses to buy low carbon cars, and reshaping the aviation industry, recognising that people do want or need to fly, but there've got to be limits to growth, and there's got to be investment in new technologies to reduce or end carbon from flying. Some of these things are things that the Transport Committee's discussed and maybe even previously recommended to government, but some of them actually are really bold ideas that we haven't discussed or considered, and I think your report will give us the courage to do so, and actually hopefully it will give ministers the courage to look at some of those bold ideas too. So this tough and sad time, as you put it, gives us a new sense of what is possible and what's necessary. The Transport Committee have committed to looking at your findings carefully, quite right, and to including decarbonisation as part of every inquiry that we conduct during this Parliament. And your help your work will help us to do that. And we're wasting no time. Next Wednesday, the Transport Committee will be questioning Alex Cruz, the Chief Executive of British Airways, and we'll have an opportunity then to ask him for his thoughts on your air travel recommendations and how they could or should be implemented. So a massive thank you for the work that you've done. It's going to have real value.
Thank you, Lillian. Moving now to Philip Dunn, who is the chair of the Environmental Audit Committee. Philip, over to you.
Thank you, Darren. Well, I'd just like to echo the other thanks from members of the committee, the select committees, for this remarkable piece of work. It clearly is unique, and I think what makes it particularly valuable as a chair of a select committee is that it's an informed set of proposals and recommendations provided by members of the public. Most of us receive information from those who have either a special interest in the subject that we're looking at, or are activists, or are have companies with a vested interest. We very rarely receive information from an informed group of the public to help us with our deliberations. And the two things that struck me particularly from the presentations that we've had this morning are the call for fairness, in effect, when we introduce measures in government to help get to net zero, and the recommendation that this is done on a cross-party basis. I think both of these things are essential to get public acceptability of the changes in behaviour that are going to be required to get to net zero. And I think that's a very valuable reminder to all of us from you that we need to bear those things in mind. Now, our committee has a very wide remit across government to look at environmental impact. And therefore, many of the chapter headings and the recommendations that you've come up with will be relevant to the work that we do going forward. And we have a number of live inquiries at the moment. And we had a presentation yesterday, as did the Treasury Select Committee, from the team, some of whom have presented to us today. And I can confirm to you that our committee will look at the recommendations as and when we have a relevant inquiry. And at the beginning of next month, we're looking at inquiries to launch for next year, and we will take your recommendations into account when deciding what work we'll be doing for new inquiries. But specifically, we are currently looking at greening the recovery. We have, after this meeting, the Secretary of State, Alok Sharma, who we heard from earlier, coming before our committee to discuss that. And we will be asking, I was very pleased he was able to join this session, and we will be asking him to confirm to us what he's confirmed to you, that he's going to take this very seriously in helping to develop the recovery measures. So I think that's really useful. We're also looking at energy efficiency in homes, and I was intrigued to see the enthusiasm of the recommendations for introducing hydrogen as a possibility for home heating, and enthusiasm for heat pumps. There's some huge challenges for retrofitting some 19 million homes out of the 29 million that we currently have in this country, which are not going to meet the energy performance certification requirement the government is looking for. So that's going to be a massive, massive challenge. We're also looking at a biodiversity loss in this country and internationally. And I think the recommendations you've made about natural capital and using nature is really important for that. And then finally, we have an inquiry underway on looking at technological solutions. So the public acceptability of, in particular, wind, which came out very clearly from your recommendations offshore, but also onshore, I think will help chime with, as we've heard, the government's intent to allow onshore wind to be subject to a contract for difference, which has been stopped for a long time. And then finally, you've also touched on waste and recycling, which has been a long-standing topic of our committee, and we're currently doing an inquiry into electronic waste and why is it that repair is essentially gone from many of the household items that we use and increasingly rely on every day. And we need to be able to recycle these things and not just have a completely disposable economy. So thank you for your work and look forward to using it in months and years to come.
Thank you, Philip, and for that comprehensive set of work that you're doing on the Environmental Audit Committee. We're now going to Clive Betts, who's the chair of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee. The floor is yours, Clive.
Thank you very much indeed, Darren, for this opportunity, and obviously repeat the thanks my colleagues have given to all members of the Assembly for the incredible work they've done. I just want to look at two particular issues to begin with. The section on in the home, obviously the Housing, Community and Local Government Select Committee will be looking at that because 50% of our emissions come from the home, as the report indicates. Also, a very important feature of the report that you need a national system, a national scheme, national policy, but you also need to recognise that one size doesn't necessarily fit all in this country. Different communities have different needs, different interests, and want to do things in different ways. And that's an important issue that comes out from the report. And indeed, our Select Committee is currently doing an inquiry into devolution. And I'm sure we want to look at how these recommendations fit with that. I just want to take one particular recommendation about the home and see how it's applied with the principles that this report really clearly lays down. And that's the need to replace gas boilers in our homes, a real major challenge for people and how they live their lives, something we assume automatically. We switch the central heating on and the gas boiler comes on and we're all warm for the winter. But what the report's saying is that we need to make the change there. You need a clear national direction, but political consensus, so people know that the policy is not going to change next year and something different come up. You need the flexibility to do things locally, because there will be different arrangements needed in different local areas. You need information and education of the public. So it isn't about, this is what's going to happen in your home, we're telling you. It's about taking people with us so they understand the rationale for this. It's about choice, and Philip's just referred to the opportunities for hydrogen. And the ITM Power, one of the major research companies in hydrogen, is based in my constituency. And it's also about the possibility of heat pumps as well. But a choice for people, so they're not told what's going to happen in their own home. They can choose that for themselves. And finally, very importantly, the element of fairness which comes out from this report very clearly, that not everyone will be able to afford these changes. So giving people financial help, grants and subsidies to make the change happen, really very important indeed. I think it's a really good case of applying the principles in practice. And so finally, what I would say, Darren, is thanks to everyone involved. You provided for us an aspirational report. Indeed, I would say an inspirational report, but very importantly, a report that is practical and deliverable and will help take the public with us.
Clive, thank you. And last but not least, before coming back to me, we have Greg Clark, who is the chair of the Science and Technology Committee, and until recently was also the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So Greg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Darren. And it's great to have this report. When I was Secretary of State, I would have loved to have had this at the time. So Alok is fortunate to benefit from the work that people have put in. And my colleagues, I wanted to thank all of the Assembly members for the commitment that they've given. You had an intense briefing and an ability to question some of the leading scientists in the area. And I think in that, in its application to climate, you've experienced actually what the whole country has experienced over the last few months, which is a much greater focus on the people doing research in our universities and research institutes. And I think it's evident to everyone across the whole country how important that work is, not just about things that we might discover, obviously in COVID as to whether we get a vaccine, but for how we live our lives and some of the decisions that we're having to make day by day. And so in many ways, what's happening on COVID, I think, has a resonance with what you have grappled with in the Assembly. So thank you for that. Like Philip Dunn, who chairs the Environmental Audit Committee, my committee, the Science and Technology Committee, crosses the whole of government, all government departments. And I think it's a particularly important perspective because, as was alluded to in various of your recommendations, to tackle the climate emergency requires a whole world and certainly a whole country and whole government approach. It can't be done in silos. And so one of the features of my committee is that we will look to support the other committees, the departmental select committees, to make sure that there is progress across all fronts. I was struck, as a number of my colleagues were, by the links that have been made to the recovery from COVID and how we need to make sure that in restoring our prosperity, we take the opportunity to do it in a way that contributes sustainable, long-term prosperity. So this is a very important moment to have these recommendations. The Science and Technology Committee has begun an inquiry, and we're taking evidence on the role of science and technology in the recovery from COVID. And so the recommendations of the Assembly are very germane to that. And we'll be talking with the Secretariat to make sure that they can be submitted so that they constitute formal evidence for the committee. So thank you for what you've done and for passing the baton to us in Parliament now.
Greg, thank you. And as chair of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee, I have the pleasure of making a formal statement to the House later this afternoon to announce that we'll be opening a standing inquiry on my committee to look at the Assembly's report in the round and how ministers are considering and adopting the principles that flow through it. I'm sure members of the Assembly will know that the BEIS department is the coordinating department across government that's tasked with ensuring departmental transition to net zero across all of the different departments in government, but also because of our responsibility for energy policy, as well as industrial strategy policy, there will be further specific inquiries that will be coming up and will be announced in due course, both as a consequence of the Assembly report today, but also with links to a Dragon's Den style pitching process we did called My BEIS, where stakeholders were able to pitch for their ideas for work that we ought to do. And there's been a strong correlation between the pitches that we've received as a committee and the work of the Assembly, which I think is shows the importance of this work, but also means we can use the Assembly report as evidence in the process of our own inquiries, both in terms of establishing our own ideas and conclusions, but also in questioning ministers on how they're going to proceed. It'd be remiss of me as well to fail to name check my predecessor, Rachel Reeves, the Member of Parliament for Leeds West, who was the chair of my committee in the previous Parliament and who did a lot of work on establishing this Assembly from the parliamentary side, and I know had been to some of the meetings and I think addressed members too. And so I would like to pay thanks to Rachel for her work. She's now in the shadow cabinet. So we've heard today from 6 select committee chairs, 2 of whom have responsibility across the whole of government, and others with specific departmental focuses, but with the most important departmental focuses on decarbonisation. And I hope that those on the webinar and those on the Assembly agree with me that what we've heard today from colleagues is a clear commitment to taking forward the conclusions of the report into the detailed policy scrutiny work that we do on our committees, but also in putting forward our own policy proposals to ministers so that we can all point in the right direction. And as select committees on a cross-party basis, which I know was a strong theme from the report. We'll be moving to the Q&A section in a few moments. For anybody that would like to ask questions, there is a Q&A function on the webinar here. If you could use the Q&A function and not the chat function, that just means we have all the questions in one place. If you would like to ask a question, could you please just include your name and your organization or where you're from, just so that I can read that out when I ask the question. And we've got a good bit of time to be able to get through some questions. Hopefully that will be of use. But before we do that, can I just pay thanks to my colleagues from the other select committee. I know some of whom need to get back to business in the House. Also a formal thanks from me to all of the Assembly members who took part in putting together what is clearly a tremendously important and helpful piece of work. To Sarah Allen and the team involved with their partners at My Society and the Petition Foundation for what I'm sure was a hugely complex process to run. And for our expert leads, both for their advice in the establishment of the Assembly and their advice to Assembly members, but also for their participation today. And last but not least, a thank you to parliamentary staff from across the House for helping to facilitate and promote the Assembly, the Media Office, committee clerks, the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, the Broadcasting Unit. There's lots of people that all have to put some work in here to make this come together. So I pay tribute and thank all of them for their work. So we're now going to move forward into the Q&A session. And as I say, if you could put that into the Q&A box, I'd be grateful. And then what I'll do is I'll read them out and I'll try to allocate them to the best person to try to answer your questions. So moving through to the first question, which I have from Theodore Bass from UKRI, which is the research and innovation function funded by government. Theodore says that he's so glad this process happened and he's aware how huge and complex the topic must have been in terms of its consideration over a handful of weekends. And Theodore's question is, if you had more time for deliberation, what areas would you prioritize further if you had more time from the work you've already done? And I wonder on that question whether one of our Assembly members might like to answer that. Was there something that you felt you didn't get enough time to consider on the Citizens' Assembly that you might do if there was further work on this in the future?
Yeah, I won't jump in with that one. For me personally, it would have been the carbon capture side of things. I just feel as if I wanted to know more about it before I could make a proper informed decision. So it was just, I'd probably say the carbon capture.
Thank you for that. Any other contributions from Assembly members on that question? Okay, I wonder if Jim Watson might want to answer that question as well. I mean, we've heard about carbon capture storage, but I know there was a few other technologies, especially in the energy generation side of the debate, that the Assembly didn't have time to consider. What were those, and what further work might be needed on those topics?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I was, as has been said, one of the expert leads for the Assembly. So in the electricity generation, as Chris said in his presentation, the members focused most on 6 technologies, which he summarised the votes on. They did have a bit of information on a few others, like wave and tidal, geothermal energy, etc., but they weren't deliberated on in as much detail. And unlike some of the other topics, such as how we travel, there wasn't a lot of time to discuss, how you might support the different low carbon electricity generation technologies, because we didn't have time to do that. So that was something you could have done more. I think the other point I'd probably note, although it was a bit hidden in the background, was, that we didn't have a lot of time to talk about industry and how industry might transition itself. There was discussion, of course, about what we buy and the products we buy, and that has implications. And many of the other areas had implications for industry, but to talk about industry itself, and again, it was simply, making choices within the time available and taking guidance from yourself and the other select committees about what the Assembly should focus on as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Jim. We have a question as well from Alex Bradbury, who's from Extinction Rebellion, who raises a question which I think is important that we discuss briefly. And he says that he's challenging the 2050 date why the Assembly focused on 2050 when there are others, including Extinction Rebellion, who make the case for that date to come sooner. From the perspective as one of the commissioning select committee chairs, we asked the Assembly to work to the date of 2050 because that's the statutory target that the government has set for us. But I wonder if, Chris Stark, whether you might want to just comment on that one briefly for me.
Yeah, just to make the same point, really, that the kind of beauty of the Assembly is that it was tackling the challenge of how you achieve the statutory targets. But it's worth saying that at the end of the process, in the final weekend, there was an opportunity for the Assembly to consider any topic that they wished to consider. And there were two proposals to look at an earlier date, which, as I mentioned in my presentation, didn't quite carry the full support of the Assembly. I don't think you should take that as meaning they didn't support an earlier date. They just didn't feel they had quite the full information to allow them to take that view, and that information wasn't provided to them, of course, as part of the syllabus here. But an interesting result nonetheless. But the main point is that this was a process really about how, not what. So, you know, this is the kind of value of it for me, is this is about the practical steps that would deliver that net zero outcome. The date is almost a kind of a secondary concern there. And of course, it's worth saying that the statutory target is 2050 at the latest. So, I mean, I think there's lots of scope here for this to be an earlier transition overall.
Thank you for that. And I would note that in parts of the report where you were able to do so, you did talk about earlier dates to make that at the latest point that Chris just made. So on gas turbines and on travel options as well, there were dates that were obviously falling earlier in line with government policy, but also pushing government policy on some of those points as well. Thank you for that. We have a question from Alison Krauser, who is talking about the value of citizens' assemblies to public deliberations. Her question is, what plans are there to fund and support not only central government public dialogue process, but help local governments to do the same? That's strictly a question to government, and we don't have a government spokesperson on the panel, I'm afraid. But I wonder if, Sarah Allen, I wonder if I might ask you about your hopes for bringing forward more citizens' assemblies and perhaps making the case more confidently off the back of this fantastic example.
Yeah, so I'd say that the Assembly members themselves asked for continued public engagement about how to get to net zero, both at a national level and very clearly at a local level as well. And I think there's a real role. The Assembly has said that local areas should be able to choose the best solutions for them in a lot of areas about how to get to net zero. And there's a real role for strong local engagement to give people a say about what happens in their local areas. So we'd really support that. The question about funding, as you said, is one for the government and others, not for involved.
Thank you for that. And I just wonder if I could ask some of the Assembly members from your own experiences, when you received that letter in the post with the little House of Commons stamp on it, I assume, and the invitation to join, what was your kind of initial reaction? Were you confused? Were you dubious? Were you excited? What do you think other people across the country might feel like if they get an invitation to take part in these processes on other topics or in their local communities? Would anyone like to come in on that question?
I'll answer that one. Well, first of all, I thought it was a hoax because I thought who's going to write to me from the House of Commons? So it was a nice surprise to find out that it was actually a genuine invitation.
Well, I'm pleased to see there's no fraudulent House of Commons stationery, which is always good to hear. I wonder, Ibrahim or Mark, whether just explain how you felt when it came through the post.
Yeah, I think it's similar to Sue. Having seen the letter, I had to kind of think twice that is this actually for real? And I think what has changed after the Assembly is that I think if we have to do something like that in future, then it is important to actually make it public, let people know a lot more about citizens' assemblies. And I think that's what we need to promote. And then in future, if something like that does come, then it wouldn't be, sort of suspicious or a surprise. But I was really, really, really glad that it was an opportunity for me, and I was really happy that I was selected. So I think a lot of people would love to be involved in this in future.
Thanks. And Mark, I'm going to call you just because you're the third member on the panel. Were you dubious as well? Or did you think this is my time, it's arrived, here is the invitation?
Yeah, that's exactly how I felt. I felt it was almost like winning the lottery. You don't often ever get a chance to participate in something like this. So I thought, yeah, grab it with both hands and go for it.
I'm sorry there wasn't a few million quid attached to the invitation, but I'm pleased you accepted it nonetheless. And I think your stories there kind of provide a real human response to this. I mean, it shouldn't, in my view, as a parliamentarian, be a surprise that you get asked by Parliament what your opinion is and how you think we should do things. And so hopefully this becomes more normal in different settings across the country where we're trying to take part in these political debates and understand the difficult things that we might need to try to do to get to where we need to be. Right, I'm going to go to the next question. I've got a question from Alex, who is also a member of the Citizens Assembly, as a question directed at me. And he says that Assembly members are given lots of time. I think Lillian said it was 6,000 hours, which is remarkable, into this process. And Alex says, looking at the massive forest fires in California and flooding in Bangladesh right now in the news, it's clear that the climate crisis is accelerating and getting more worse faster than we had imagined. And I certainly agree with you on that, Alex. And your question to me is that I've said today that the Base Committee will begin an inquiry. And your question is, what other immediate actions will the 6 committees take to get us moving towards net zero? And I think you've heard from the other select committee chairs that there are already some live inquiries that committees are working on, and the work that the Assembly has done will provide a real important evidence base because it gives us the substantive insight to be able to say to ministers, well, the British people as represented by this Assembly think that this is a priority. We therefore need you to be able to get on and get on with this, which I think is really, really powerful to us. And of course, we've also heard that the Transport Committee is already looking at these and the Environmental Audit Committee too. I think the important thing to note for anybody that isn't familiar with select committee inquiry processes is that they do 2 things and they have a really powerful kind of end point. So the 2 things that they do is that they gather evidence from experts and stakeholders, and now including this report that you put together. And we present that in a political context to Parliament on a cross-party basis and to ministers. The second thing we do is then we get ministers and civil servants before us, and they can't really say no when we invite them. And so we can ask them questions publicly on the record to hold them to account about what they are and what they're not doing. Now, the end of the process is really important because what we're then able to do is get a formal response from government to all of the detailed kind of recommendations in our report. And we're able to go back to that and revisit it and to be able to force that accountability with ministers. And so all of the work that we'll be doing on our committees will add real immediacy and impetus to the findings of your report, which I hope shows the commitment that we're making to you today as Assembly members to take this forward. Okay, going to the next question. Oh, sorry, my screen moved a bit. Richard Smith, who is the chair of the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change, asks, if all the recommendations were implemented, would they add up to achieving net zero by 2050? I wonder if, Chris, you might be able to take that one for me.
Yes, so it's important to say that this is not a full technical assessment of the steps to get to net zero, but everything that the Assembly discussed takes us on the path to net zero, and we were careful in constructing the process, in particular, to come to some arrangement at the end where we accommodated their earlier decisions, and in particular on the discussion of greenhouse gas removals, we wanted to understand their opinion on how to mop up the remaining CO2 from those residual emissions. So I think when you look across this, it is broadly a package that would deliver net zero. We haven't done the quantitative analysis that would allow us to say that it exactly reaches net zero, but you can see in the recommendations that in every area, this is the kind of step that would be needed to be taken in every sector and in every area of our lifestyles and society to get to net zero. So it's a really comprehensive take. And crucially, from a totally different perspective from the more technical assessments that my organisation might make. So it's really, really useful complement to that style of work.
Thank you for that, Chris. Next question. I should say we've got lots of questions flowing in now. We've got about 10 minutes, so I'm going to have to apologise up front that we're not going to be able to get through all of them, but we'll keep at it. So we've got a question from Harry Pearce from the University of Cambridge, who wants to know how disagreements were managed in the Assembly process, how the kind of compromises were reached, and how that process was managed. So I wonder, Sarah, if you might just kick off an answer to that. How did you manage disagreement and dissent and reach compromise? We could probably learn from that here in Parliament, actually. So I'm interested to hear your answer.
Yes, there's a couple of parts to that answer, I think. So the first is about how you ensure discussions are respectful and tolerant and so on. And there are a number of ways in which you do that. So the first is by allowing Assembly members to set their own conversation guidelines to guide how they'd like each other to behave during the process. And they talked about things like respecting each other's opinions, even if they disagreed with them, the importance of listening to each other. And then the facilitation team helped ensure that everybody stuck to that, although to be honest, the Assembly members stuck to it themselves throughout the process to make it a good experience for everyone. The other thing to say is about how the conversations themselves were structured. So every time the Assembly was considering a recommendation, people discussed, first of all, both what they liked, what they didn't like, and any conditions they wanted to attach to that recommendation. So everybody had a chance to consider each other's points of views in each of those areas before they then went to vote by secret ballot, which meant that everybody had a chance to put forward their opinion. But then when they finally went to vote, they didn't have to worry about what other people were kind of looking over their shoulder. They could express their real point of view. But that a chance for everyone to get their point of view out first and to have it considered and listened to by others was really important.
Thanks. I wonder if any of the Assembly members want to comment on that. Were you kind of anxious about disagreement at the beginning? I mean, there have been other political issues recently where it's been perhaps difficult for people who have different views to talk about these things, and climate change can be quite controversial too. How did you experience that process? Anyone want to comment on that?
Oh, I mean, I didn't have any problem at all, and there wasn't any disagreements. You might have disagreed with somebody's attitude or the way that but everybody was very respectful, and we all got the opportunity to say what we wanted to say.
Great, good to hear. And I think it's important that we recognise that it's okay to disagree on our own conclusions, but that can be done in a kind of open and collegiate way. Thank you for that. I'm going to move to the next question now. We've got one from Hannah White, who is from the Institute for Government and also a trustee of Involve. And it's a question to committee chairs asking what we think about the Citizens' Assembly model for future work and whether we feel that we would benefit from having more processes like this in our work on the committee. What I can't see on my screen is if I've got other committee chairs still here who might want to come in on that.
I have Darren Clive.
Great.
Betts, if you. Okay, shall I come in? Yeah, this is actually, I think, the second time we've used the Citizens' Assembly model. The first time the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee and the Health and Social Care Select Committee commissioned an assembly to look at the whole issue of social care. So I'll just sort of dampen expectations a little bit here, because the report we got from the Assembly was unanimously received and agreed with in major part by both of the select committees. 22 members of Parliament said yes, that the principal recommendations on social care, we agreed with, and we wrote into our final report. The problem is, 3 years later, we're still waiting for government to respond. So, you know, there are challenges. You can often get general agreement to very sensible recommendations, and I think you'll find that select committees generally do follow up and are very positive about the recommendations in this report. The real challenge then is to get government of all political persuasions to implement them in the longer term, and that's something that select committees have got to do to put real pressure on following this report.
Thank you for that, Clive. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I understand that there are some Assembly members who have some questions they might like to ask too. So if I could invite questions from Assembly members. I don't know if we've got some from our panelists, if there are questions there, or whether they are coming in from the panelists. Yeah, so Ibrahim, you've got your hand up. The floor is yours. What's your question?
Yes, so my question is kind of linked to COVID, actually. Because one of the problems that we've seen is that we need to get the economy back. And so my question is to the committee, how will we ensure that our recommendations become a priority and the efforts to tackle climate change and COVID-19 go hand in hand, as opposed to climate change being pushed aside? It is very, very easy to say that we need to get the economy back up and running and put things aside, but we really need to kind of make things go green. So how can you ensure that?
Yeah, thank you for that, Ibrahim. I'll take that one. You heard from Mel Stride and from myself earlier, that we have the two, I think, economic recovery inquiries at the moment. Mel will be looking at how do you kind of borrow money and spend money and have to tax in order to pay that back. And on my committee, we'll be looking in more detail at how businesses operate in that space and looking at things like industrial strategy and research spending. And I think the key thing from my perspective is that it's not an either or debate anymore. Both have to happen at the same time. And in many ways, this kind of disastrous pandemic has provided an opportunity because we're going to have to borrow significant amounts of money and we're going to have to spend a lot of money because of the economic consequences of the pandemic. And that doesn't happen to that scale very often. And so my real hope, and this is the work that my committee will be doing, is that when politicians talk about building back better, that actually means something substantively. And that when we are kind of spending money on projects or taking policy decisions or prioritizing parts of the economy, that's done with the explicit understanding that the kind of net zero journey is baked into that process. It's not something that can be put to one side or that is dealt with in its own kind of specific policy area somewhere else. It has to be at the heart of our economic recovery. And to be fair to the government, you know, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have talked about this and they've said that they agree with that. And it's our job now as select committees, as well as you as citizens and assembly members and for the whole of Parliament, to keep ministers on their toes and make sure that they deliver on those promises. Okay, we've got a couple more minutes. Was there any other questions from the assembly members on the panel?
Yeah, I've got one as well.
Thanks, Mark.
One of the things that we felt strongly about as an assembly was fairness. In the 1980s, when the mines were closed down, there was no support for mining families or communities who lost their jobs. This caused much hardship. What will you as committees do to make sure no workers are left behind on the path to net zero?
Yeah, well, the challenge of being in a committee, of course, is that we don't have our hands on the purse strings, but we do make recommendations to government. And I think, and this goes a little bit to Ibrahim's question, the link between the kind of COVID recession and the net zero transition means that there is going to be a lot of movement in the labour market. You know, we've already seen a significant number of redundancies, more than we would ever like to have seen. We've seen different sectors being affected in different ways. And you're going to see a kind of different approach to recovery and growth in the future as a consequence of that. And so from my perspective, it's about saying, how do you help workers transition if they need to transition either to a new job in the first place or into new sectors or new skills? Now, I'm a Bristol MP, and so I've got a lot of aerospace businesses in the north of the city. And so my conversations in that sector, of course, are always around synthetic fuels or composite materials, maybe electronic flight. How is the industry having to change to meet the declining numbers of people flying? And that conversation has been accelerated by the COVID pandemic. And so my hope is that you can connect all of these dots in a way that says that we can move in the right direction together, but we will require government, because this is government's job, to put in support for workers, for trade unions and for businesses as we try to iron out some of the bumps as we go through. Certainly my strong view, and I'm sure that the view is shared from our committee chairs, is that you can't just leave this to the market and to the climate. Government has to provide leadership on this, and we will certainly be expecting that. I don't know if any of the committee chairs want to come in on that question.
Darren, could I just come in? Oh, Clive. Yes. Just to re-emphasize what you say, I think it is important. It's about the public and private sector working together. We've got in my constituency the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre. One thing we're brilliant at in this country is inventions. Very often that doesn't translate into innovation and to actually putting those inventions into practice and creating jobs. And so doing that and looking at how we're going to transform the way we work in this country, seeing what that means in practical terms for industry, and making sure we then start to manufacture and develop and produce those things in this country. I mentioned ITM Power, one of the leading hydrogen research companies in Europe. That is doing work now across Europe. It's really important we see that as a basis for creating new jobs. And that's so important. And it's about government and industry working together. 600 apprentices are actually being trained in engineering in Sheffield at present through this joint partnership between government, the University of Sheffield and the private sector. That's the way forward to make sure this translates into real good paid jobs for people.
Thank you, Clive. I'm conscious that we've timed out, but I want to just give Sue an opportunity if she has a question to ask it. Sue, did you want to ask one?
Okay. Can you tell me as committees how you're going to take forward the Assembly's recommendations regarding better information and education for the public? Would you agree that simple short messages to educate the public would have a more long-term effect, something maybe similar to the 1970s public information adverts like Charlie the Cat?
Thank you, Sue. I have to confess, I don't remember the 1970s adverts, but I'm going to ask Lillian if maybe she wants to answer that, because I think public messaging on transport is a really interesting issue. Lillian, do you have a comment on that?
Well, unlike you, Darren, I definitely remember Charlie the Cat. Thanks, Sue, for reminding us. I mean, I think one of the things that came out really strongly from your report is the importance of public messaging. Now, I don't know, it would be quite a challenge to get the public messaging that explains the reasons why we need it in those sort of sharp, short little things like the adverts were. But I think it's absolutely right. We've got to think, I mean, obviously that was a television-based advert. That might not be the only way we need to now be conveying messages. Obviously, there's loads of different channels through which people get their information, particularly on social media. But we definitely need to find ways to share. I mean, you went through 47 speakers and put in all those hours. How can we do it in a much sharper, easier way of telling people why we need to do something and what the choices are that helps them to be able to do it, and what government's doing too, because it isn't just about individuals, it's about the leadership that government provide in all of this.
Thank you, Lillian. We will have to call the session to an end now, but thank you so much to all of you for your contributions, your questions, your presentations today. And again, a big thank you from me and behalf of all of the select committees for this fantastic work. I'm now going straight into a committee meeting about what we're going to be announcing on this, and then I'll be on the floor of the House later this afternoon. So you can see the impetus is really here in action. So thanks so much to all of you. It's been a pleasure to chair this meeting this morning, and we bring this session to an end. Thanks so much.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.